Hayek's sensory order is a seminal work, which is another word for original. It is a work that only recently is receiving due recognition, but which is central to understanding Hayek's work generally. The sensory order anticipates developments in neurology, psychology, and in artificial intelligence research, and it is relevant to social theory. Hayek's mind theory contrasts with that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes refuses to clutter what he assumes to be the finite capacity of his brain space. He has a self-imposed ignorance in order that he should not overfill what he regards as the pigeonholes of his brain. Sherlock Holmes' concept of the human mind is analogous to the memory store of digital computing. The file space is limited. The Sherlock Holmes theory of the mind invokes the notion of the grandmother cell. The grandmother cell is a parody for arguments against one-to-one coding, against the idea that a unique neuron represents a unique object, that one's grandmother, and the memory of her, rather, is stored in a single location in the brain. Hayek's first crucial insight came in rejecting the notion of the grandmother cell. And he writes at the beginning of the sensory order, "What I had from the beginning been unable to swallow was the conception that a sensory fiber could carry, or a nerve cell store, those distinctive attributes that we know mental phenomena to possess. Even so, recent work sets a place the grandmother cells of a kind as a theoretical limit to what is known as sparseness. This is the idea that at later processing stages, neurons become increasingly selective for combinations of features. But I'm going to leave that to the psychologists. So we might recognize two paradigms: the Sherlock Holmes theory of the mind, digital computing, and Friedrich Hayek's theory of the mind. Two paradigms with mutual compatibility, with the former, Sherlock Holmes, and the grandmother cell, as a limiting form of the latter. So we have Hayek's mind theory, which introduced the paradigm which is known as connectionism. And the idea is that neural connections are strengthened as they are used. And particular connections are used with greater frequency when they serve a purpose, in leaving an individual better placed, or more comfortable, or more durable, his survivability. Connectionism has very wide and general application. Gerald Edelman's work on artificial intelligence is especially notable. Gerald Edelman acknowledges Hayek's seminal thesis. As he says, the essence of his analysis still remains with us. Edelman's analogy, the metaphor that he chooses to put across the idea, is that memory is more like the melting and freezing of a glacier. Edelman's glacier metaphor admits to no distinction between our memory of past events and our continuous mental engagement with present events. Past events set our understanding of the present, and present events alter our understanding of the past. There is no beginning and there is no end. And it strikes me that these features are akin to Otto Neurath's metaphor for the development of knowledge. That it is possible to rebuild a boat whilst it is at sea. But you can only build that rebuild that boat one plank at a time. And there is no hint in regard to the origin of the boat or to its eventual configuration. Seems to me the analogy is there. Edelman's description of memory as a form of constructive recategorization during ongoing experience fits Friedrich Hayek's own representation of mental properties as, quote, the place of an impulse in a system of relations between neurons, and Hayek's representation of the central nervous system as, quote, a process of continuous and simultaneous classification and constant reclassification. The description that Hayek gives, a process of continuous and simultaneous classification, parallels Edelman's description of a network that, quote, recreates and revises past and present associations. The implication that can be drawn from these descriptions is that whenever familiar items are revisited, the representation is never the same. A thought is always unique. It is never recalled in precisely the same way. Hayek's sensory order was published in 1952, and it originates from a student manuscript, which I understand is to be published in the next volume of the collected writings of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek explains the circumstances of his work in the introduction to the sensory order. He found himself working during a period of university shutdown during a bleak winter in the laboratory of a brain anatomist. And he describes himself as having felt that he'd found the answer to an important problem, but that he could not explain precisely what that problem was. 25 years later, he identified the problem in the questions, what is mind, and what determines the difference between different sensory qualities. By Hayek's own recognition and judgment, the sensory order is at the center of his social theory. He regarded it as, quote, the most important thing I have yet done. More important, to be among the more important contributions to knowledge, the insights I gained both from the first stage in 1920 or later in the 1940s were probably the most exciting things that occurred to me and which shaped my thinking. So it must have been extraordinarily disappointing to him, as Ralph Harris reports in writing Hayek's obituary, that Hayek should have felt that nobody understands it. The general relevance of the sensory order is that in psychology and in social theory, the same metaphor is applied in describing the structural processes that constitute the mental order of the mind and the social order of mankind, and in describing the evolutionary dynamics of neurological processes, the psyche, and mutual changes of all kinds, our society. Both for an individual mind and for society, order emerges from interaction between constituent elements. Order is, quote, determined by the regularity of the actions towards each other of the elements of a structure. Order emerges from interaction between constituent elements. The further relevance of the sensory order to social theory shows in Hayek's discussion of scientific method. Publication in the same year as publication of the sensory order, the counter-revolution of science. Hayek's discussion of scientific method points to the fact that physical science is independent of history. The speed of light is not contingent upon historical context. By contrast, memory is critical to all evolutionary systems, to psychology, to social theory, to all aspects of the human condition. History is relevant. I need to make a brief side comment to take note of important differences in evolutionary timescales. Biological evolution is protracted. Some would argue that it's now stationary. Social evolution is rapid. And this means that our deep-seated psychological dispositions are the result of natural selection against events and conditions that are long past. So that our behavioral characteristics are largely atavistic. They are a legacy of evolved traits that are no longer relevant. This has been described, Henry Plotkin, as the thesis of ancient provenance. We have inherited dispositions and phobias whose relevance is long gone, not only in regard to our fear of open spaces or to dark places, but also in our natural sense of social justice in terms of outcomes. And the practicality of this notion of social justice, as Hayek argues, is limited to small groups, and we are no longer actors within small groups. As Daniel C. Dennett says, we notice things that mattered most to the reproductive success of our ancestors. In this context, Hayek notes that many of our innate psychological dispositions are incompatible with an extended socio-economic order. And so those innate dispositions must be constrained. Although we still share most of the emotional traits of primitive man, he argues, the obedience to learned rules has become necessary to restrain those natural instincts which do not fit into the order of the open society. In focusing upon human understanding in its psychological dimensions and in its social dimensions, Hayek's ontological presumption is that a material world exists, of which the mind is a part. He describes three orders. There is a physical order. There is the neural order of the brain, which is part of the physical order. And there is the sensual order, which is the mind, our psyche, who we are. And drawing upon analogy, I would suggest, and have suggested in the article I referred to, that these three orders might be viewed as analogous to a composer's vision, which we can categorize as the inaccessible truth. Only the composer has direct contact with his vision. Then we have the orchestra with its musical score, which are the media of communication. And then we have the symphonic performance, which is a subjective experience unique to one listener. And within this, the instrumental notes might be seen to parallel the individual neural engagements. For a man in a society, the basic questions are, how does our knowledge grow? How do we anticipate the reactions of others? And how do we decide upon our reaction? to others. Well, the answers are that we use any method that conveys information. Just like the melt and the freeze of the glacier, our minds are altered continuously by our presence in a material world, as sensory phenomena are continuously updated as responses to sensory information, as their usefulness is tested by experience, and as neurons and their connections become differentially strengthened through their repeated use. But there is no asymptote of definitive knowledge. Although we drive towards a truth, we are constrained by inherent capacities. We have no way of knowing what it's like to be a bat. The knowledge of every species is species-specific. It's relevant to its own survival in its particular environment. We cannot know definitively what it's like to be another person, though we have reason to believe that introspection gives keen insights. And we cannot know definitively how our mind functions, because we have to use our mind in order to understand our mind. So our knowledge is necessarily speculative, partial, and problematic. Our knowledge derives from our genetic makeup, from parental guidance, from formal instruction, from established science, and from successful existence. Human understanding is embodied in an analogous fashion by the mind, serving to protect an individual, and by the social framework, serving to protect individuals. The mind creates, is an individual. The social framework creates, is culture and society. Culture, the social framework, coordinates our decisions, inhibits our decisions, and informs our decisions. In setting the matrices of spontaneous developments, mutual adaptations shape categorizations and associations as they are embedded in the mind as its response to sensory stimuli, and as they are embedded in social institutions as they incorporate rules for behavior. The mind and the social framework are self-organizing, spontaneously involving, open adaptations. A sensory experience is defined, is categorized by neurological relationships. This is the sensory order. An individual is defined, is identified by social relationships. This is the social order. Both the mind and the social framework economize upon, make best use of, incomplete information. The mind has evolved to know what it needs to know. So, for example, eating is better than not eating. Sleeping is better than not sleeping. Gerald Edelman's explanation is in terms of a deep-seated neurophysiological structure, which he calls the value system, which he argues projects over the entire cortex. The social framework has also evolved to make effective use of the partial and dispersed knowledge of what Hayek frequently refers to as the particular circumstances of time and place. So we see the general theme in the parallels in the analogous details of the respective functions of the mind and the social framework. So let me ask you, which of these two citations strike you as the genuine one, and which has been fabricated on the basis of the other one? Is it the first, taken from the sensory order? Individual neurons are merely the foci in the network of relationships, and it is the multiple interplay of impulses between neurons which forms the recurrent, recognizable, and familiar events of the social structure, of the structure. Now, is that from the sensory order? Or individuals are merely the foci in the network of relationships, and it is the various attitudes of the individuals towards each other which forms the recurrent, recognizable, and familiar elements of the structure. Is that the genuine citation from the Counter-Revolution of Science? Both publications, 1952. Hayek's subjectivism is set firmly within this general evolutionary framework. Understanding is determined by evolved capacities, by knowing what it is necessary to know in order to survive, by acquiring effective knowledge, and by the effective use of knowledge. In every aspect, what a given species and a given individual of that species needs to know is unique. There is no definitive knowledge. Moreover, particular material circumstances cannot be matched with particular patterns of behavior. Hayek's subjectivism recognizes commonalities across individuals that provide us with a rationale for general precepts, for education, and for social institutions generally. Yet there is a uniqueness in each individual, and that uniqueness delivers a critical conclusion for a system of justice. Hayek argues there is no metaphysical self against which we can compare any actual disposition that we have. And because of that, there can be no mitigation of sentencing upon the basis of extenuating circumstance. Not everyone is brutalized by brutal circumstances. To admit extenuating material circumstances would, in Hayek's words, destroy the chief device which society has developed to assure decent conduct, which is the pressure of opinion that makes people observe the rules of the game. Hayek's subjectivism insists that in order to understand human behavior, we must understand what an individual thinks about objective circumstances. And Hayek sets this against what can be known by the objective methods of science. However, this does raise a problem, because when everything is mediated through a unique brain, everything must be known subjectively. So there is a difficulty in the distinction between Hayek's an objective fact and Hayek's a subjective phenomena, between the laws of nature, as they are generally acknowledged in any contemporary society, and those that figure in the works of the natural scientists. Hayek writes, if the current scientific knowledge of society which we study included the belief that the soil will bear no fruit till certain rites or incantations are performed, this would be quite as important for us as any law of nature which we now believe to be correct. But belief in certain rites or incantations does not exclude the possibility of their having material worth. Action initiated to appease a pagan deity is more likely to be retained if it is associated with some sign that the gods are pleased. Deities might welcome gifts of fish, subjective belief. Fish might enhance soil fertility, objective fact. Or both, or neither. The general problem is that there is no objective position. There is no definitive scientific rigor. Inescapable problems arise from this absence of definitive criteria for objective scientific rigor. Structures and events are accessed through the mind. Objective methods are corrigible. Data are theory-laden. Theories are creations of the mind. And there is no sharp distinction between lay and scientific explanations. But this is a general issue. It is not a Hayekian issue. In regard to subjectivism, Hayek's position might be summarized in three parts. The first is that individuals have a common mental structure. People perceive the world and each other through sensations and concepts which are organized in a mental structure common to all of them. Second, social science must use introspection, which is irrelevant to physical science. Social science is different in that it, quote, can explain human action in a way we cannot with physical phenomena, with meaning that is not applicable to physical phenomena. And thirdly, subjective implies that a common mental structure permits differences of perspective and opinions. Quote, knowledge and beliefs, while possessing that common structure which makes communication possible, will yet be different and conflicting in many respects. Scientism receives particular criticism from Hayek. Scientism is the misguided belief that social phenomena may be accessed directly. It is motivated, he argues, by a fear of subjective concepts, and it succumbs to the collective prejudice of treating social phenomena as if they were objects directly perceived by us as wholes. And this is directed as much at Keynesian economics as it is against social political theory. So to conclude, Hayek's theory of complex phenomena catches the dynamics of adaptive processes as they relate to the human condition, to an individual's unique understanding, and to the social order that exists between individuals. The spontaneity of adaptive processes allows inconsistencies to be reconciled so that interaction is coordinated in respect of the sensory impulses of the mind and of individuals in mutual engagement.